For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jenny Stewart and I'm currently President of Humanists Victoria. So welcome everyone. Tonight's presentation is going to be very interesting, I have no doubt. We're going to hear from Matthew Roberts, who's the policy officer at the peer-led organisation called Sex Work Law Reform Victoria, and he'll be assisted or accompanied, or Christine McQueen, who's a businesswoman and private escort, will also be speaking and telling her story. So the topic for this evening is legal but banned: financial discrimination against sex workers. However, before we start, I'd like to invite you to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land wherever you are this evening. Here at Balwyn Library, we're on the land of Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation, and we acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as the first people of Australia who have never ceded sovereignty. They remain strong in their enduring connection to land, waters, and culture, and we have much to learn from them. There may be some people in the audience this evening who are not familiar with humanism, and I thought I'd just give you a brief outline of our values. Humanists Victoria works to build a more civilised society, fostering ethics based on human values. We consider that reason, free inquiry, and a scientific approach enable us to understand our universe and our place in it. We defend freedom and democracy and provide a positive alternative to religion and dogmatic creeds. We support separation of church and state and secular education. We're also strong advocates for human rights. And in fact, this year, I'm pleased to say that Humanists Victoria have given financial support to the Human Rights Law Centre for their work towards achieving a much needed federal charter of human rights. Now, Matthew, in fact, is no stranger in some ways, because in September 2019, with Lisa, who will also be saying a few words this evening, he gave a talk to Victorian humanists, and that talk was entitled Sex Workers, Fundamental Christians, and Radical Feminists. It's a lot to get your head around. However, a lot of the discussion centred around the issues that will come up again tonight, and they were workers' rights, health, and safety. And on that occasion, a lot of the oppositional forces that people in the sex work area face were also explored and addressed. So for many of the people who were at that meeting 3 years ago, they found it a revelation, actually, to hear from people working in this industry, and it opened their eyes, and I hope it opened their minds. So what happened subsequently was that in November 2019, Fiona Patten, who's a member of the Victorian Upper House, and incidentally, I should add, was Australian Humanist of the Year in 2020, Fiona was asked by the government to lead a review into sex work and make recommendations for decriminalising sex work in Victoria. It had already been decriminalised in New South Wales, and of course other countries have decriminalised sex work too. But Fiona led an inquiry, and there was subsequently a public consultation, and the end result was that a bill was drafted and was successfully passed in February of this year. It's going to come into force in various stages over the next 18 months. And so it will be interesting to hear this evening what difference it has made, and it is hoped it will make. But of course, decriminalisation is one thing, changing attitudes is another. So financial discrimination which is the topic for this evening, which sex work law reform like to call debanking. And I have a bit of trouble with that because I keep reading it as debonking, which I think that's not what you're into. It remains a problem for sex workers across Australia. Matthew will speak about how our legal system permits debanking, and Christine McQueen will reveal which banks banned her and why. Even when sex workers are able to work legally, as they are now in Victoria, almost all banks and other financial service providers continue to ban them. And the question for discussion is, why is this? So I'd like to welcome Matthew, Lisa, and Christine, and I'll leave it up to you at this point to tell us what we need to know.
So good evening, everyone. My name's Lisa Dallymore. I'm the president of Sex Work Law Reform Victoria, and we just want to say thank you very much for joining us tonight. So tonight's presentation is about financial discrimination, including debanking. So who are we? We're a not-for-profit volunteer group lobbying for the legal rights of sex workers. We were very involved in the campaign to bring about decriminalisation, but the legal rights of sex workers includes financial rights. So why us? Why are we speaking to this issue? Our group is a sex worker-led organisation. We here tonight are current or former sex workers ourselves who care about making the world a just, safe, equitable place for sex workers. You'll be hearing from Matthew Roberts, Sex Work Law Reform Victoria's Policy Officer, who will explain what we mean by financial discrimination and debanking, and who will provide some background to the issues we're going to cover. And we're very lucky tonight to have Christine McQueen, businesswoman extraordinaire, to share her own experiences of being discriminated against by financial institutions and financial service providers. Christine's a private escort and a porn star and has many years of wide-ranging experience in this industry, here and overseas. She's an extremely busy person and we're very grateful that she's joining us this evening. We believe that sex workers' rights are workers' rights, which is why we're speaking out about financial discrimination. It's a complex topic and we have a lot of information to impart tonight. There will be a question and answer session after the presentation, and we may imagine that you will have many questions. So 2 things to keep in mind. When we talk about what we do, sex work and sex worker are our preferred terms. The words prostitution and prostitute carry so much historical stigma and association and imagery that none of us today can hear those words with open ears. Secondly, it isn't always easy for sex workers to speak openly about what we do. We can feel exposed to prurient and voyeuristic curiosity at best, and at worst to judgment and hostility. We ask that when we reach question time, that you please keep questions on topic. So now it's time for me to hand the podium to Matthew, who will give us an overview of tonight's presentation and provide some context to tonight's talk. Thank you.
So thank you, Lisa, for that introduction. My name is Matthew Roberts, and I want to start off by getting people to think about their own lives and their own reliance on banking in Australia in 2022. When was the last time that you used an EFTPOS machine, an ATM, or internet banking, or did online shopping? How often do you have transactions in and out of your bank account? And think about what it would mean if that was all taken away suddenly and how you would feel. That's what we're here to discuss today, which is debanking, also known as financial discrimination. I'd like to start off by talking about who is being discriminated against. And we've got 2 industries here that we can talk about. One is the sex industry, which is in-person commercial sexual services. This includes brothels and private escorts. We also have the adult industry, which includes stripping, pornography, and adult product retailers. All of these industries experience rampant debanking, and collectively, they represent tens of thousands of workers. So this is a familiar face to many humanists. Of course, that's Fiona Patten there. And the first question that comes up in relation to sex workers accessing banking is sex work legal in Victoria? Well, the movement for sex workers' rights started in the 1970s with an activist named Cheryl Overs. By the 1980s, the industry was partially legalised. And as Jenny referred to, our group has been very busy, along with Fiona Patten, fighting to fully decriminalise the industry. And a bill passed, the Sex Work Decriminalisation Act. That's a law that passed earlier this year. And that means that sex work will be decriminalised in Victoria. What this model of regulation does is it treats sex work like a similar service business, like a hairdresser, so that the industry is regulated by standard business regulation, such as tax laws, council laws, OH&S laws, and other business regulation laws. Speak about sex work without talking about the city of Boroondara. Now, we are right now in Bolwyn, in the city of Boroondara, and the first stage to achieving justice for in the banking system for sex workers is to decriminalise sex work so that we can work legally. But there are many barriers to achieving that. And one big barrier is Melbourne's Conservative Council, the City of Boroondara. This council last year took a strong position against sex work decriminalisation, putting up a motion and voting 10-1 against the decriminalisation of sex work. It may be of no surprise that the council has Christian prayers at every council meeting still. And the council also voted to conduct an awareness campaign, I call it a scare campaign, to notify residents of the dangers of sex work lurking in the suburbs. I am pleased that the sole dissenting voter at that meeting, Councillor Victor Franco, is here with us today. So that's City of Boroondara, and we're pleased to have Victor Franco here, the councillor. So working legally, if sex work is now legalised or decriminalised in most of Australia, why can't sex workers just get on with business and pay their tax? What's the issue? The issue is that despite working legally, there's almost a complete ban on sex workers by financial service providers, including the major banks that we all are familiar with. And that brings me to the next issue, which is, what is discrimination? It's a word that we all know, but do we understand what it really means? Anti-discrimination laws are state laws. They vary across the country. And we can have a different basis for discrimination. We can have race, religion, gender. Those are some familiar bases that discrimination can occur. It can occur in many different settings: education, government, goods and services, and of course the workplace. And discrimination can be lawful or unlawful. I'll give you an example of lawful discrimination based upon age. If you get car insurance, the company can actually charge you higher insurance if you're under the age of 25. Now, why is that? That's because we have actuarial data that shows that under 25 drivers are at a higher risk. And therefore, the companies can actually charge a higher premium for that age group. And in terms of the enforcement of anti-discrimination laws, we can have a conciliation process, and we can also enforce the laws through courts and tribunals. Now, what does Australia have to say about anti-discrimination laws protecting sex workers? It's a mixed picture from this map here. We have a weak protection for sex workers, which is lawful sexual activity. And what that law means is that a company can't discriminate against a person on the basis of their lawful sexual activity. This only applies to sex workers who work lawfully, something that's not available for many sex workers in Australia in states where it's not legalised or decriminalised. And lawful sexual activity applies in Queensland, Tasmania, and here in Victoria. A better law for sex workers is occupation. And this law says that a company is not allowed to discriminate against a person on the basis of their occupation, whatever that occupation is. And that's a law that only exists in the ACT and Victoria. In Victoria, we're proud to have fought for this law to be introduced earlier this year, meaning that Victoria is now the jurisdiction in the world with the strongest anti-discrimination protections for sex workers. Discrimination against the sex industry is pervasive, it's culturally entrenched, it occurs daily, it's fairly well documented. However, it's been largely ignored by governments and policymakers for decades, and it impacts all areas of a sex worker's life, whether it's education, the workplace, or in the banking system. For me personally, it's something that I come to expect in my life whenever I have to reveal my occupation, and it makes my life more stressful and complicated than it would otherwise need to be. So keep in mind here, I feel like a teacher at this point, we've got two different concepts here that are very different. We have the decriminalisation of sex work, which is one set of laws that can enable sex workers to work legally. Separately from that, we have anti-discrimination laws that protect people from discrimination. These are two different sets of laws and they aren't always aligned. In today's talk, we're only going to focus on discrimination within the financial services sector. So who is banned? It's individuals operating legally, and it's also small businesses operating legally, like a brothel. Who else is banned? We also see other legal industries, Bitcoin traders, gun dealerships, vape shops, and gold dealers. Collectively, this amounts to hundreds of thousands of Australians at risk of debanking in all of these industries. Debanking is also an international problem, particularly in the USA. In India, which arguably has the world's largest population of sex workers, with some estimates putting the population in the millions. In Mumbai, India, sex workers organised and formed their own bank for sex workers. And this was a solution that lasted for 10 years, a rather fascinating story of how sex workers in that country dealt with the discrimination that they were experiencing. We also see, and to me, this is a really disturbing phenomenon, we see entire families being banned. And late last year, a woman contacted me. She's not a sex worker and she never has been. And she had been in her branch of the Commonwealth Bank right here in Melbourne. And she was there to open up a new account. And then the bank said, we've got an issue and we can't help you. They handed her a letter, and the letter was a closure letter saying that all of your accounts will be closed within 30 days and you're not welcome to ever come back. This is a commercial decision. Please leave the building immediately. She was treated like a criminal and she felt very unhappy with the conduct. She was confused. Later that week, she realized that her brother and his wife had also been banned from the same bank on the same day. Her brother is a brothel owner. So what the bank had done is she had a joint account with other family members and had the same surname. So the bank was aware that all of these three customers were related. And when they targeted the brothel owner, who operates a legal brothel, they also targeted the other family members, closing all of their accounts. A complaint within the bank and a separate complaint to an external body went nowhere. The bank refused to give a reason and would not reverse the decision. So this is a situation of collective punishment and discrimination by association, and it's not the only case. We're seeing an increase in this kind of conduct. We can see here Samantha X, a Sydney-based escort. She recently went public with her battle with ING Bank, who debanked her. Following that revelation, other non-sex workers came forward and said that they'd also been cancelled by ING Bank. So we're seeing here the problem moving beyond sex workers and into the general population, who could be next? Could you be next? That's the question that I ask you to, I want you to ask yourselves. So then I guess another question comes up, who is guilty? Who is doing the discrimination? And there are two types of financial service providers involved here. The first one is a bank. I think we all know what a bank is. It's where we store our money. The second one is a merchant provider. And this is generally only provided to small business people, which is what sex workers are. And that's an EFTPOS machine. When you pay for your groceries at Coles or Woolworths, you tap on the machine. That's what a merchant device is. Keep that in mind because Christine will be talking a lot about merchant providers when she speaks. Merchant providers, we've got PayPal, and we've also got another example is Square Payments, where you just tap and go with your card to pay for goods and services. Now, this is one of my favorite slides. Who's the worst offender? Because I do like to name and shame the companies. And the councils, yeah, you know, just name it. One of the things that I first want to acknowledge is it's really hard to actually identify who is the worst player, because a big part of the problem is we're seeing a lack of transparency. The companies are not talking about this. They are loath to talk about it, and they don't reveal their policies. The policies can also change, and they don't make their policies public. But two policies that have made their policies public, two companies that have revealed what they do are PayPal and NAB. NAB is a shocking case study. It was happy to have escort agencies and brothels for decades. And then in 2019, it cancelled all of them. One woman who was an escort agency owner complained to the bank, which went nowhere. She then complained to the banking regulator, AFCA, and AFCA's decision was the discrimination was okay because of the manner in which it was conducted. She was given 30 days notice, therefore it was fine. Now, what is being banned? The short answer is it's everything. It's business bank accounts, personal accounts, merchant services, insurance, loans, credit cards, and bank accounts unconnected to sex work. The bans are often explicitly stated to be lifetime bans. Once they kick you out, they say you're not welcome to come back. And all of this discrimination, I guess, begs the question, why would a sex worker disclose their occupation? Why would they need to do that? Well, sex workers use business banking products because they are business people, they're sole traders, rather than being employees. And business banking requires the applicant to reveal their occupation or their industry at the application stage. That's a requirement. And also some sex workers are actually proud of what they do. They don't want to live in fear or in hiding, and they want to openly state what they do. And that's another reason why they might disclose. How does the discrimination occur? Again, there's a lack of transparency, but we do see that some individuals at banks take the moral high ground, one staff member, and they might decide to make a decision on their own on behalf of the bank and not permit somebody. We also see verbal inquiries. So when a sex worker is at the branch or on the phone, they could be discriminated against at that point. One of my own stories is, and I've repeatedly had this happen to me just last year, I was on the phone applying for a new product. They asked me for my occupation and I answered honestly. There was silence on the phone for 5 seconds and then the line hung up. And I shortly later got an email saying, you're not welcome, we won't take you. So literally the how is it takes about 5 seconds in that particular case. And we also see existing customers who've got a product that can then be taken away at any time. This is really the why. The why is really what this whole talk is about. And it is in part about religion. There are many reasons, to be fair. One reason is religion or moral risk. Banks assess risk, and one type of risk that they identify is moral risk. I called every bank in Australia in 2020 to ask what their policy is about sex work. One bank that I won't name, off the record said, we ban all sex workers because we subscribe to a fundamentalist view of religion, and that's our code, and therefore we won't tolerate sex workers. But they said that's off the record. So I won't name the bank, but it is a member of the ABA, the Australian Banking Association. Banks also cite a money laundering risk, human trafficking risk, differing sex work laws across state boundaries, as well as reputational risk. The banks feel that if they work with sex workers, that will be a reputational risk for their shareholders. And the banks also talk about risk appetite. It's a commercial decision that they make because they're not willing to tolerate what they feel is a risky client. Money laundering is often cited by the banks. AUSTRAC is Australia's financial crime fighting agency that tackles money laundering. And AUSTRAC has the power to issue the banks with fines. And the actual fines that apply are really quite mind-boggling. In 2018, the Commonwealth Bank was fined $700 million by AUSTRAC for money laundering. In 2020, Westpac Bank broke records and was fined $1.3 billion by AUSTRAC, again for money laundering. We see here that there's a difference between perceived risk versus actual risk. There's really no evidence that sex workers or the sex industry does pose a high money laundering risk, but that is the perception amongst the banks, and that's what's driving these decisions. This is what I call the push and pull model of money laundering. And this is really the key slide, I think, that explains the entire issue of debanking. So this is a model that I've created here. And what we see is we see the bank in the middle, and it's being pulled and pushed in opposite directions. In the red, we see that AUSTRAC, which is cracking down on money laundering, AUSTRAC has the power to issue those enormous fines. And the threat of those fines terrifies the banks to the extent that they would do anything to avoid those fines. And they've made a decision to ban certain industries that they classify as risky to avoid those fines. On the other side, we have a very weak force pulling the bank, much weaker force than the red one. And that's the risk that sex workers will fight back legally and take legal action at courts or tribunals under anti-discrimination law. This generally involves no financial penalty, and so far there have been 0 successful cases anywhere in Australia where there was a final decision published. So what we can see is that there's a completely unequal forces pulling and pushing on the bank, and the banks and other financial service providers are overwhelmingly being influenced by that threat of the fines from AUSTRAC. And that's what I believe is really driving the situation that we're seeing with debanking in Australia at this point in time. As I said before, money laundering risk, there's really no evidence that it is a high-risk industry. AUSTRAC identifies a number of high-risk industries, and the sex industry is not on that list. Human trafficking, we see about 1 conviction of a human trafficker a year on average in Australia. So again, fortunately, it doesn't appear to be very common. And organised crime and bikies, it often comes up in the media, but again, we don't see a lot of police data that supports that being a pervasive thing in the industry. I guess all of this complicated, models and money laundering, it just makes you wonder, well, what does all this have to do with the sex workers on the ground? Carrying cash, the effect on the sex workers. The sex workers may have to carry cash because they can't take card payments. That can present a safety risk when they're walking in public or if they're in their house or at a hotel room. The industry is kept underground, even if the industry might be decriminalised in a certain state. So just a warning, the next slide does describe violence. I talked about carrying cash and how that can complicate things. There is a story of in 2016, a sex worker in Canberra in a hotel room, prospective client arrived carrying a box cutter knife, threatened that sex worker with that box cutter knife demanding cash, and then raped the woman. This is a very disturbing example of how when people know that sex workers are more likely to carry cash because of debanking, they might deliberately be targeted in that way. So that's a very serious real-life example of the effects of that, of the debanking. Sex workers are also excluded from the formal economy. They have a status as outsiders, and it confines us to the margins of society, and it can damage our reputation, and we can lose a lot of money as a result of this discrimination. In terms of tax, do sex workers pay tax? When we lobbied the Liberal Party, this question came up quite a lot. ATO tax data from 2020 shows that only 115 people lodged tax returns under the occupation sex worker. This is out of thousands of sex workers who operate legally. Now, what this tells us is that sex workers are paying tax in many cases, but they're doing so under a different occupation. And that brings me to the next issue of how do sex workers access banking? The key answer is cover occupation. This is an alternative occupation that they use when engaging with financial service providers. And a common example would be fitness instructor, which is a credible alternative occupation that they can use to try to get access to the services that everyone else has there. So have sex workers taken legal action? There's a small number of cases at equal opportunity commissions, even smaller number of cases in tribunals and VCAT, and a handful of cases in the Supreme Court. The tribunal and court decisions have not succeeded when they've gone to a full contest hearing. And the Equal Opportunity Commission cases, it's often done by conciliation behind closed doors. So it's hard to know what the outcome was there. Sex workers can also go to Small Business Ombudsman and the banking regulator. Small Business Ombudsman reports a 95% failure rate because in the conciliation process, the banks need to come to the table in good faith, and they simply refuse to budge on their position of banning sex workers. The banking regulator, which is AFCA, doesn't have jurisdiction to hear discrimination cases. So in many cases there, the sex workers also don't succeed. And we see both sex workers, the sex industry, and other occupations like the Bitcoin traders really not succeeding anywhere in any legal mechanism at the moment. And that's why we believe that reform is needed. But why would you take legal action if you have to reveal your legal name in public? That's a huge concern for a lot of sex workers who are very concerned about privacy and the stigma around their job. It can take years in courts and tribunals. It can cost in the hundreds of thousands of dollars as a starting price. AFCA, the bank regulator, lacks jurisdiction. And we also see that the attitude of the legal professionals, including judges, is really quite poor. They don't want to recognise that sex work can be stigmatized and discriminated against. And so the judgments, there's a very narrow interpretation of the law, and we're just seeing that the decisions there are not working in the sex worker's favour. One sex worker lost her case when she took it to court because the discrimination that she experienced was based on her sex work activities rather than her sex worker status. And that distinction was enough for her to lose the case. So what needs to be done? We need a test case. We need a sex worker to have the financial backing to go all the way potentially to the Supreme Court to get a published decision that confirms either way what the situation is. This will require pro bono legal representation, and it may also need amendments to anti-money laundering laws. It would also help to have cultural change amongst the legal profession. And the banking regulator, AFCA, needs to have jurisdiction to handle debanking cases specifically. And we want the banks to assess people on their individual risk rather than on industry risk as a whole there. So where does this end? Sex workers were the first target. Then it was Bitcoin traders and other industries. Who's next? Where does this end? Could you be next? If you're not a sex worker, this could be a problem for you. What can you do? Well, if you know any sex workers in your life, we would love to hear their story. If they've suffered financial discrimination, please ask them to come forward. We can assist and we can provide them with safe advice about their options. We've got a volunteer here at the front, Luca. He is got business cards and other contacts, and I'll put some details in the Zoom chat for the contact details there as well. So what are we doing about all of this? Well, we're fired up, we're angry, and we're also organised. So we're preparing a test case. We're assisting sex workers to go to the Equal Opportunity Commission. We're supporting federal amendments to various laws. We're engaging in forced transparency. We are naming and shaming those companies, and Luca has a handout there to find out whether your bank bans sex workers. It's on the list there. Grab a copy at the end. We're engaging with the media, and we're also warning sex workers about confidentiality clauses. What we see with equal opportunity commissions is that it's a conciliation process, and like sexual harassment victims, the banks are very keen to silence sex workers by demanding that they sign a confidentiality clause, a gag clause. And I have complained myself, and every time that I've been to a conciliation process, the first thing that the bank asked for was sign confidentiality clause. This is significant because if a sex worker signs that, they can't speak. We know that debanking is a massive issue, and sex workers win when we talk more about it. The banks win when we talk less about it. And so that's why we're here to talk. And enough of me. I'm going to just get ready for, you have to get ready for Christine McQueen. She's a very special person. With Christine McQueen, I just want to emphasize that discrimination that we've discussed involves legally operating individuals and businesses, and it can be difficult for people to recount the emotions that they've experienced. So thank you for Christine for coming here today. Christine's story is by no means unique. I should emphasize again the distinction between sex work laws and anti-discrimination laws. New South Wales decriminalised sex work decades ago, and so sex workers in that state can operate legally. However, anti-discrimination laws are separate, and in New South Wales, there are no anti-discrimination laws to protect sex workers. At the time Christine experienced financial discrimination, she was living in New South Wales. This segment is going to be more like an interview where I'll ask Christine some questions about her experiences. So I want to start off by saying that you've experienced financial discrimination by several companies.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us about the first instance of financial discrimination and run through how that played out?
Okay. All right. So about 10 years ago, I was running a couple of concurrent businesses. I was a private escort, obviously, Christine McQueen, and I had a small boutique escort agency, and that was called CMQ Escorts. And I had merchant services like Visa and MasterCard. Oh my God, I just got nervous just right now. I'm going to imagine you're all naked or something. I need to kind of relax a little bit, be in my own space. Everything was fine. I did the application with Bendigo Bank, and we just trucked along like a normal small business. I was also at the same time developing a small third business, which was a boutique brothel. So basically, gosh, what happened was we have shift managers back then, and these ladies took a booking for another lady that we represented and would manage their time and so on and so forth. And so the client turned up, and I wish I could name his name, but I'm not allowed to. Yeah, and we went through the process of doing the admin. You know, we asked for his license, so the person in the photo matched the name to match the credit card, called up for the authority, so on and so forth. We also had like private CCTV seeing him, entering and exiting, obviously not in the room. And everything went fine. Okay, just another day. So a week later or so, the customer decided that he didn't want to pay for those services. He wanted free services, and he, as a card holder, credit card, you can do like a chargeback if you dispute a charge. And Of course, we appealed. It was like, hell no. And we put together all our evidence and explained, that absolutely was him. And the Merchant Service Department of Bendigo Bank, got his, evidence and came back to me and said, well, we side with the card holder. And I'm like, on what proof? Well, he says that he was impersonated. I was okay. But that just blew my socks off, or stockings or whatever. It blew my mind. And this organization is telling me with all the evidence, irrefutable, and that they accepted an answer that is just mind-bogglingly made up, and just went, well, there you go. So I thought perhaps that there was something wrong with Bendigo Bank and that I should express myself very clearly and creatively and unsavory and colourful, that they are fucked in the head. So, are we allowed to swear here? I'm sorry. If you invite me, there's going to be words, okay? There's C-bombs, there's the whole bit. You're all adults. So basically, based on that conversation with the Merchant Service Department, they obviously did not like me challenging their decision. Obviously, I was horrified, but I didn't know at that moment that the game was rigged. I was obviously like the emperor's new clothes. I was deluded. I honestly thought the banking community was like, go use sex worker, giving us all your money. This is, I had no idea that I was not on a level playing field. I can handle that, perhaps a business through, I don't know what justification, but just imagine there was a good justification. Didn't want my business. After I left that bank, I was like, okay, well, you can get stuffed and I'm going to go off and find another bank because there's lots of other banks around, right? So this is not the end of the world. That they did something at Bendigo, which absolutely, it just crushed me. And they listed me and blacklisted me on the MasterCard Visa blacklist. Not for fraudulent behavior. And I didn't rip anyone off. I wasn't acting criminally. I wasn't acting criminally. And they put me on this list and I wasn't told that I was basically shadow banned. Oh my God. You couldn't have fucked me over anymore. It was, anyway, I'll get to that later. So basically I tra-la-la off and I've got this new business that's, the brothel, and it's sucking up money, and I've signed a commercial lease and I'm going to have card services, right? Like I'm betting my standard of sex work, which is really high, right? And whether I like it or not, I'm basically like the OG, the online celebrity of sex workers. When I say, hey, you should be banking and you should be getting houses, and these women got okay. Like they really listened to me, and I'm getting absolutely slayed, and I'm going from ANZ to, oh my God, I get the list. ANZ, I do a couple of applications and I get knocked back. And I think, okay, that's unusual, but looking for merchant services. Okay. I then did NAB. Now, unfortunately, they did come to my office, and I was recently given like a birthday gift, which was a giant goblet full of candies with the word pimp on it. I think that was just too much for them. They're like, okay. I just sort of, we're all just sort of, I spent a lot of time lingering and looking at the back of the cup, and they were looking at the front of the cup, and we all just sort of sat there, and it was really awkward. So they were a no, obviously. And then there was Commonwealth. Commonwealth was in and out really quick. They're just like, get out. I was like, okay. So I left it for a little while, and I went back to ANZ, and I was really meticulous on my application. Like, I am a sex worker. I have sex, lots of sex on sex. And they're like, okay, we get it. All right. But I just like, just in case there's any ambiguity, I'm having sex for lots of money, right? And they're like, okay, right? So they give me the merchant services, and then somewhere in there, and I'm being really serious when I say this, is that I can actually pick up discrimination through the inflection, like the dilation of a pupil, or in the tone of voice, even if they're sticking to script. and they're going through all the stuff they need to say on, you know, through the process, I can clock it. I can it's so subtle. It's like, oh shit, I'm in dangerous waters again. Like, so ANZ then cancelled my merchant services, and you know, and obviously, you know, I was furious because I went out of my way to express exactly the nature of me and what they're used for, and they just can't seem to get it together. And I know other peers who have successfully maintained ANZ, for example, merchant services. So this is indiscriminate. It's not a level playing field. It's very you know, it gives you sort of like a false hope that you might pull this off. All right, so I leave it for a little bit, and we're just taking cash. And needless to say, the brothel failed, and my escort agency was, you know, not as competitive, you know, like, you know, I lost a lot of face in front of my managers, especially. They were like, you know, like, oh my God, all hail the Christine McQueen mystique. And I can't get merchant services. I look like an idiot. I did look like an idiot. My competitors were howling. I mean, I was terrified people were going to find out. And even like customs were like, is everything okay? You know, like it's sort of, we had them and then it fell off the face of a cliff. And it sends a message that things are not okay when they should be okay. And I'm panicking, you know. I'm also working 100 hours of physical labor a week. I'm not a 2-bit sideshow escort. I'm a serious provider doing a really high standard. On top of that, I was a mother to teenage kids. I've got a bunch of wild escorts running amok. I've got awesome, you know, managerials. Like I was a real business person in every sense of the word. So I just eat humble pie, and I just tell my management, I tell the girls, we're just going to have to just limp along and bank and get deposits and so on and so forth. So we're doing old school banking. I'd just like to mention that they never canceled my mortgages, just FYI. And I think that's very telling. All right. So they're going the big money here, but how you get it into the bank, well, anyone's business, right? So then by this stage, we're like 2015, 2016, and the era of the banking apps is coming along. And I'm thinking, oh, sweet. All I have to do is just fill it out. I'm scrolling down the little clicker looking for, you know, what's your occupation? I'm like, am I entertainment? Am I holistic services? Like it's never the romper room, you know, and oh, electricians and oh, sex workers. Like I never get called out on those drop-down menus. So I'm like, what am I? So I joined, my accountant actually recommended this little app called Square. And I looked them up, and they've got a HQ in New York and they had a HQ in Victoria. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is amazing. We're going to have, you know, services again, this little cute little thing that, you know, clicks onto your phone, and we've got this app. So basically I got the services, I contacted them. I'm, you know, a sex worker, blah, blah, blah. They're like, yeah, just fill it out, babe, whatever. And so I joined their app. I do one booking, and afterwards I'm waiting for like the money to go from Square to my bank account. There's no activity, and I'm kind of like, oh, I'd really like some of that money. And I contacted them, and they're like, oh, look, you know, the app was pausing, and so they shut down my services to the app. But they didn't tell me that, you know, and they were like, oh, I didn't, you know, they also skirted over me being a sex worker, even though I'd addressed it over the phone, but that wasn't part of the application process. So basically I got kicked off that platform. So by this stage, I'm now furious. Like I've kind of sucked it up for a long time, and I've internalized a lot of this rage, and it's starting to kind of come out right now, actually. And I'm like, am I asking life the wrong questions? I started Googling, and I was Googling things like, can I be a sex worker and get merchant services? Oh my God, what I saw come through on that Google page was just global discrimination. I mean, MasterCard, Visa cartel of blacklisting people. You don't have to be a sex worker, you can just be anyone who pissed off somebody at a branch. It's like, oh my goodness, it's pretty light on detail, very undemocratic. So, okay. So basically, where do I head to now if I waffled on too long?
So I have a follow-up question, Christine.
Okay.
You were banned by Bendigo.
Mhm.
How much money did you lose?
Okay, so until I recently got some merchant services over the last year. So I've been in the wilderness for say like what, 8-9 years. About $1 million conservatively, yeah. Yeah.
I think that that's it for our talking, Q&A now, Jenny.
Yes. Okay, we'll have a bit of a pause. Thank you, Christine.
Thank you.